Sometimes the most broken souls find each other when the world has given up on them both. In a dusty frontier town, a vicious German shepherd named Brutus terrorized anyone who dared come near, until he met Eli Boone, a weathered cowboy with nothing left but heartache. Brutus had wandered into town with a torn ear and eyes full of rage, his past wrapped in violence. The townspeople wanted him gone or worse. Eli was barely scraping by, sleeping in stables and living on odd jobs, his dreams buried beneath years of disappointment. But when these two damaged souls crossed paths, something truly extraordinary happened. Could the gentleness of one broken man heal the fury of an abandoned dog? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek, a frontier town that had seen better days and worse ones too. Dust swirled in lazy spirals down Main Street, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. The town sat nestled between rolling hills that stretched toward mountains in the distance, a place where folks minded their own business and expected others to do the same. In the back corner of Murphy's livery stable, Eli Boone stirred from his makeshift bed of horse blankets and straw. At 62, his body protested every movement, joints creaking like old barn doors as he sat up and rubbed the sleep from his weathered eyes. The stable smelled of hay, leather, and the earthy musk of horses, a comfort that reminded him of better times. Beside his bedroll sat a worn leather saddlebag, its surface cracked and faded from years of use. The brass buckles had lost their shine long ago, and one of the straps had been mended with careful stitching. Inside that bag lay the remnants of Eli's former life, a deed to land he no longer owned, a wedding ring he couldn't bear to wear, and a photograph of a family that existed now only in memory. The saddlebag was both anchor and burden, holding pieces of the man he used to be before life had bucked him off and trampled his dreams into the dust. "Morning, Eli," came a gruff voice from the stable entrance. Joe Murphy, the livery owner, was a stout man in his 50s, with calloused hands and a generous heart hidden beneath a gruff exterior. He'd been letting Eli sleep in the stable for 3 weeks now, accepting whatever odd jobs the cowboy could manage in exchange for shelter. "Morning, Joe." Eli's voice carried the gravelly texture of a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping rough. He folded his blankets with military precision, a habit from his younger days that had never left him. "Got some work for you today, if you're willing," Murphy said, leaning against a wooden post. "Mrs. Henderson needs her fence mended, and old Doc Whitman's got some heavy lifting that needs doing at the clinic." Eli nodded, grateful for the opportunity to earn his keep. In his previous life, he'd owned a ranch that sprawled across 300 acres, employed a dozen hands, and raised the finest cattle in 2 counties. Now he lived day to day, dependent on the kindness of folks who barely knew his name. The fall from grace had been swift and merciless, starting with a drought that lasted 3 years and ending with bank foreclosures that took everything he'd built. "Appreciate it, Joe," Eli said, reaching for his hat, a battered Stetson that had seen him through countless storms, both literal and metaphorical. As he prepared to head out, the sound of angry voices drifted in from the street. Murphy's expression darkened, and he shook his head with evident frustration. "That damned dog again," he muttered. "Sheriff's going to have to do something about it soon, or somebody's going to get hurt real bad." Through the stable doors, Eli could see a crowd gathering near the general store. At the center of the commotion was the reason for the town's latest headache, a German shepherd that had wandered into Willow Creek 2 months ago and proceeded to terrorize anyone who crossed his path. The dog was magnificent in his fury, black and tan coat gleaming in the sunlight, ears alert, and eyes that burned with an intelligence made dangerous by whatever trauma had shaped him. Brutus, as the townspeople had taken to calling him, stood near the store's porch, with his lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth like ivory daggers. His left ear bore a jagged tear that spoke of violence in his past, and scars crisscrossed his muzzle like a roadmap of pain. He was thin but powerfully built, every muscle coiled with the tension of an animal that expected attack from any direction. "Get back!" shouted Tom Bradley, the store owner, wielding a broom handle like a weapon. "Shoo, get out of here!" The dog's response was a low growl that seemed to rumble up from the depths of hell itself. Women clutched their children closer, and men reached instinctively for whatever weapons they carried. This wasn't the first such confrontation, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Sheriff Jack Morrison pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Morrison was a fair man, well respected in the community, but even his patience was wearing thin. He'd tried everything short of shooting the animal, traps that the clever dog avoided, attempts to drive him out of town that only seemed to make him more determined to stay. "Easy now," Morrison said, though whether he was addressing the dog or the increasingly agitated crowd was unclear. "Nobody make any sudden movements." Dr. Samuel Whitman stood at the edge of the crowd, his medical bag clutched in one hand and a walking stick in the other. The town's physician was a thoughtful man who'd seen enough suffering to recognize it in others, even those who walked on four legs. His eyes held a sadness as he watched the standoff, understanding better than most that the dog's aggression came from a place of deep pain. "He's going to hurt someone," whispered Martha Henderson, the schoolteacher. She was a stern woman in her 40s who genuinely cared for the children in her charge. What if he goes near the school? The concern was valid. Just last week, Brutus had cornered young Billy Patterson behind the blacksmith shop. The boy had been unharmed, but the terror in his eyes had haunted his parents ever since. The dog seemed to operate by rules only he understood, sometimes ignoring people entirely, other times flying into rages that sent everyone scattering. Eli watched the scene unfold with a mixture of interest and recognition. He'd seen that look in the dog's eyes before, not in animals, but in men. It was the look of someone who'd been broken so thoroughly that trust had become a foreign concept. It was the look he saw in his own reflection some mornings when he caught sight of himself in Murphy's old mirror. As the crowd continued to grow, more voices joined the chorus of concern and complaint. There was talk of forming a hunting party, of putting the animal down before someone got seriously hurt. The dog seemed to sense the hostility directed toward him, his stance becoming more defensive, his growls deeper and more threatening. "We can't let this go on," declared Frank Morrison, the sheriff's younger brother and the town's blacksmith. Frank was a hot-headed man who solved most problems with his fists or his hammer. "That beast is a menace. It's only a matter of time before he tears someone apart." Others nodded in agreement. The consensus was building toward a final solution that wouldn't end well for Brutus. Eli could see it in their faces. Fear was transforming into resolve, and resolve in men who felt threatened often led to violence. What struck Eli most was how alone the dog was. Completely alone, with no one speaking for him, no one considering that his aggression might be born of desperation rather than malice. It was a loneliness Eli understood intimately. Since losing his ranch and his family, he'd felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him like a physical force. The standoff continued for several more minutes before Brutus suddenly turned and loped away, disappearing between buildings with the fluid grace of a creature that knew every shadow and hiding place in town. The crowd dispersed slowly, their conversations filled with renewed determination to solve the dog problem once and for all. Murphy shook his head as he watched them go. "Poor creature," he said quietly. "Whatever happened to him before he came here, it must have been something terrible." Eli said nothing, but Murphy's words echoed in his mind as he went about his morning routine. He thought about terrible things, how they changed a soul, how they built walls that seemed impossible to breach. He thought about second chances, and whether they existed for creatures like him and Brutus, outcasts who no longer fit in the world they'd once known. As he prepared to leave for his day's work, Eli carefully tucked his saddlebag behind some feed sacks where it would be safe. The bag represented all he had left of his former life, but lately he'd been wondering if holding on to the past was preventing him from finding any kind of future. The sun climbed higher, promising another hot day in Willow Creek. Somewhere in the maze of buildings and alleyways, a scarred German shepherd nursed his wounds and planned his next move. And in the livery stable, a broken cowboy gathered his few possessions and tried not to think about how much he and that dog had in common. The incident happened on a Tuesday afternoon, when the heat hung over Willow Creek like a suffocating blanket. Eli had just finished mending Mrs. Henderson's fence and was walking back toward the livery stable when he heard the commotion erupting from the town square. Sheriff Morrison had finally decided to take action. He'd enlisted the help of 3 men, his brother Frank, Tom Bradley from the general store, and Carl Henley, who ran the saloon, to capture Brutus using ropes and nets. Their plan was simple: corner the dog, restrain him, and transport him far enough from town that he wouldn't find his way back. The German shepherd had been sleeping in the shade behind the feed store when they found him. Even in rest, his body remained coiled with tension, ears twitching at every sound. The men approached with the careful steps of hunters stalking dangerous prey, Morrison holding a crude rope halter they'd fashioned from thick hemp. "Easy does it," the sheriff whispered to his companions. "Get that net ready." But Brutus was too smart and too wary to be taken by surprise. His eyes snapped open the moment their shadows fell across him, and he was on his feet in one fluid motion, lips already pulling back in a snarl that made the men step backward instinctively. "Now!" Morrison shouted, lunging forward with the rope halter. What followed was chaos. Brutus exploded into motion, his powerful jaws snapping at anything within reach, while the men tried desperately to contain him. The net tangled around Frank's legs, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Tom Bradley stumbled backward, swinging his stick wildly, while Carl Henley shouted instructions that no one could hear over the dog's furious barking. Morrison managed to get the rope halter around Brutus's neck, but the moment the hemp touched the dog's throat, something primal and terrifying was unleashed. Brutus fought with the desperation of an animal that had been restrained before. Restrained and hurt. His powerful muscles strained against the rope, and his struggles became so violent that Morrison was pulled off his feet. The rope, never meant to hold such force, began to fray. Strand by strand, the hemp fibers gave way under the assault, until finally the halter snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Brutus, now free but more enraged than ever, turned on his captors with renewed fury. His eyes had gone wild, and foam flecked his muzzle as he advanced on Morrison, who was scrambling backward on his hands and knees. That's when Eli arrived. He took in the scene with the quick assessment of a man who'd dealt with dangerous animals before. The dog was beyond reasoning, lost in a storm of trauma and rage that had been triggered by the feeling of rope around his neck. The men were panicked, reaching for weapons that would only escalate the situation toward tragedy. "Don't!" Eli's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. "Nobody move." To everyone's amazement, including his own, Eli stepped forward, not aggressively, not with any weapon or restraint, but with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who understood the language of frightened animals. "Easy," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone that somehow carried over the dog's growling. "Easy now." Brutus turned toward this new threat, his hackles raised and teeth bared. But something in Eli's posture, the lack of aggression, the absence of fear, gave the dog pause. Eli wasn't advancing like a predator or retreating like prey. He was simply standing there, his hands visible and empty, making himself available without making himself a threat. "That's right," Eli continued, taking another careful step. "I see you, boy. I see what they did." The broken rope halter lay in the dust between them, its frayed ends speaking of violence and desperation. Eli had seen rope burns on horses, knew the terror that restraints could bring to animals that had been brutalized. This dog's reaction told a story of suffering that made Eli's chest tighten with recognition. "You don't trust anybody," Eli said softly, now close enough that Brutus could have lunged and torn his throat out. Can't say I blame you for that. The dog's growling began to quiet, though his stance remained defensive. There was something in Eli's eyes, a weariness, a pain that matched his own, that Brutus seemed to recognize. They were both creatures who had been broken by life, who had learned that survival meant expecting the worst from everyone around them. "Get back, Eli!" Morrison called from his position on the ground. "That animal's gone crazy!" But Eli ignored the sheriff's warning. He crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. The movement should have triggered another attack, but instead Brutus tilted his head slightly, studying this strange human who didn't behave like the others. "What do you say we call it even?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't hurt them and they stop trying to hurt you." For a moment that stretched like eternity, man and dog regarded each other with a mutual understanding that transcended words. Both had been pushed to their breaking points. Both had fought against forces trying to control them. Both had lost everything that once mattered. Then, as suddenly as the violence had erupted, Brutus stepped back. His muscles remained coiled and ready, but the immediate threat had passed. He looked at Eli for another long moment, as if memorizing his face, then turned and disappeared between the buildings with the same ghost-like silence that had brought him to town. The aftermath was a mixture of relief and bewilderment. Morrison struggled to his feet, dusting off his clothes and trying to process what he'd just witnessed. The other men gathered around, their voices filled with questions and amazement. "How did you do that?" Frank Morrison demanded, his tone somewhere between admiration and suspicion. "That beast was ready to tear us apart." Eli picked up the broken rope halter, examining the frayed ends with an expression of sadness. "Maybe he was just scared," he said quietly. "Scared?" Tom Bradley laughed harshly, but there was an edge of hysteria in his voice. "That wasn't fear, Eli. That was pure rage." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Eli replied, coiling the broken rope in his weathered hands. "Fear can make any creature dangerous when it's got nowhere else to go." Sheriff Morrison studied Eli with new interest. There had been something almost mystical about the way the cowboy had handled the situation. A calm authority that spoke of experience with more than just horses and cattle. "You've dealt with animals like that before?" Morrison asked. Eli was quiet for a long moment, still staring at the broken halter. "I've dealt with broken things," he said finally. "Animals, people, myself. Sometimes the meanest ones are just the ones that hurt the most." The crowd that had gathered to watch the capture began to disperse, their conversations filled with accounts of what they'd witnessed. Some saw Eli as a hero who'd prevented bloodshed. Others wondered if his intervention had only postponed an inevitable tragedy. The dog was still out there, still dangerous, still a threat to their community. But Eli's mind was elsewhere. As he walked back toward the livery stable, he couldn't shake the image of Brutus's eyes in that moment of recognition. There had been intelligence there, and pain, and something else. A desperate longing for understanding that Eli knew all too well. That night, lying on his bed of horse blankets, Eli found himself thinking about broken rope halters and second chances. He thought about what it meant to be feared and misunderstood, to carry scars that nobody else could see. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the stable walls, a German shepherd was probably thinking similar thoughts, nursing wounds that went far deeper than the torn ear everyone could see. The encounter had changed something fundamental between them. A connection had been forged in those few moments of mutual recognition, a bridge built from shared pain and understanding. Neither of them knew where it might lead, but for the first time in months, Eli fell asleep thinking about something other than all the things he'd lost. 3 days after the incident in the town square, Eli made his first deliberate gesture toward Brutus. He'd found an old, dented water bowl behind the livery stable, a scratched metal basin that Murphy had been planning to throw away. The bowl bore the marks of years of use, with dings and dents that spoke of countless meals served to horses and dogs long gone. Eli filled it with fresh water from the well and set it in the alley behind the general store, a place where he'd noticed Brutus often passed during his ghostly wanderings through town. He didn't wait around to see if the dog would approach. Instead, he left the bowl and went about his daily work, checking on it periodically throughout the day. The first morning, the bowl remained untouched. The second morning it was empty, though whether from Brutus or one of the town's cats was unclear. By the third morning, Eli began adding scraps of meat alongside the water, pieces of jerky from his meager supplies, leftovers from meals shared with Murphy. "You're wasting good food," Murphy observed, watching Eli prepare another offering. The stable owner's tone was gentle but concerned. "That dog's nothing but trouble, Eli. Folks are starting to talk." And they were talking. Eli could hear the conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, could feel the sideways glances that followed him down Main Street. The incident with Brutus had elevated his status from harmless drifter to someone worthy of suspicion. People wondered what kind of man could calm a vicious dog with just a few words. Some thought it was admirable. Others found it unsettling. "Maybe trouble's all relative," Eli replied, settling the bowl in its usual spot. "Could be we're all just looking at things from the wrong angle." The truth was, Eli had no clear plan for what he was doing. He only knew that the look in Brutus's eyes haunted him, that familiar expression of an intelligent creature backed into a corner by circumstances beyond its control. When he looked at the dog, he saw himself, alone, unwelcome, carrying scars that made people uncomfortable. On the fourth day, Eli arrived to find the bowl not just empty, but moved. It had been pushed several feet from where he'd left it, as if Brutus had been testing whether this was some kind of trap. The message was clear. The dog was aware of the offerings, but he wasn't ready to trust the giver. Eli smiled grimly as he refilled the bowl and returned it to its original position. Patience was one of the few virtues that poverty and loss had taught him. When you had nothing left to lose, time became a resource you could afford to spend freely. Sheriff Morrison approached him that afternoon as he was finishing some carpentry work for Dr. Whitman. The lawman's expression was troubled, and Eli could sense the weight of community pressure behind his visit. "Eli, we need to talk," Morrison said, settling his hat more firmly on his head. "About the dog. What about him?" "People are concerned. They think your intervention the other day might have given him the wrong idea. Like maybe he belongs here now." Eli set down his hammer and turned to face the sheriff. Morrison was a decent man, caught between his own instincts and the demands of his office. The worry lines around his eyes had deepened in recent days. "What kind of wrong idea?" Eli asked. "That he's safe here, that we're not going to do something about him eventually." Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tom Bradley saw you leaving food for him. Folks think you're encouraging him to stay. And what do you think, Sheriff?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, watching a dust devil spiral down the street. "I think that dog's been hurt bad by someone, and hurt animals are unpredictable. But I also think you handled that situation better than the rest of us did. Then what's the problem?" "The problem is that most folks don't see it that way. They see a vagrant cowboy who's gotten too friendly with a dangerous animal. They're starting to wonder if maybe both of you might be better off somewhere else." The warning was delivered kindly, but it was a warning nonetheless. Eli had encountered this attitude before in other towns, other circumstances. People could tolerate one problem, a drifter or a stray dog, but when the two became associated in their minds, tolerance quickly turned to action. "I understand," Eli said, though understanding and agreeing were different things entirely. That evening, as darkness settled over Willow Creek, Eli made his way to the alley with another bowl of water and some bread he'd saved from supper. As he rounded the corner, he froze. Brutus was there, standing beside the bowl, drinking. The dog's head snapped up at Eli's approach, water dripping from his muzzle. For a moment, they stared at each other across 15 feet of dusty ground. Eli could see the war playing out in Brutus's amber eyes, the desire for sustenance warring with the instinct to flee. "It's all right," Eli said softly, not moving any closer. "Don't mind me." Brutus took a step back, then another, but he didn't run. Instead, he settled into a cautious crouch about 10 feet away, watching as Eli approached the bowl and set down the fresh bread. "There you go," Eli murmured, backing away to give the dog space. Nothing fancy, but it's honest food. To his amazement, Brutus waited only until Eli had retreated a respectful distance before approaching the bread. He ate quickly, efficiently, keeping one eye on the human throughout. When he finished, he looked directly at Eli for a long moment, not threatening, not grateful, but acknowledging. Then he melted back into the shadows as silently as he'd arrived. Walking back to the livery stable, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. It wasn't much, just the simple act of providing food and water to a creature that needed it. But it felt like a small step back toward the man he used to be. Someone who took care of things, instead of just surviving day to day. Murphy was waiting for him when he returned, sitting on a bale of hay with a serious expression. "Town council's meeting tomorrow night," Murphy said without preamble. "Word is they're going to discuss the dog situation. And your situation too," Eli nodded, unsurprised. "Small towns operated on consensus, and when that consensus turned against you, options became limited quickly. Appreciate the warning, Joe. It's not just a warning, Eli. It's an opportunity." Murphy stood up, brushing hay from his pants. "You could leave. Tonight, tomorrow morning, before things get complicated." The suggestion hung in the air between them. It would be the practical thing to do, the safe thing. Eli had been running from complications for 3 years now, moving from town to town whenever staying became more trouble than leaving. But as he settled onto his bedroll that night, the dented water bowl clean and ready for tomorrow's offering, Eli found himself thinking about running versus standing still. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was refuse to move, especially when moving meant abandoning someone who needed you, somewhere in the darkness. A scarred German shepherd was learning that not all humans meant harm. And in the livery stable, a broken cowboy was remembering what it felt like to be needed again, even if only by a creature as lost and unwanted as himself. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Thursday morning when Eli found Brutus huddled beneath the overhang behind Doc Whitman's clinic. The dog was shivering, his coat dark with moisture, and for the first time since Eli had known him, Brutus looked less like a fearsome predator and more like what he truly was, a lost animal seeking shelter from the storm. Eli approached slowly, carrying the dented water bowl and a piece of bacon wrapped in cloth. The rain drummed steadily on the wooden overhang above them, creating a cocoon of white noise that seemed to muffle the rest of the world. "Wet morning," Eli said conversationally, as if addressing an old friend rather than a dog that could tear his throat out. "Can't say I blame you for seeking cover." Brutus watched him approach, but didn't retreat. Perhaps the rain had washed away some of his usual wariness, or perhaps the regular offerings of food and water had begun to erode his distrust. Whatever the reason, he allowed Eli to come closer than ever before, close enough that Eli could see the individual water droplets clinging to his whiskers. "That's a good boy," Eli murmured, setting the bowl down just a few feet away. As he straightened up, something caught his eye in the corner where debris had collected against the building's foundation. There, half buried beneath fallen leaves and refuse, was an old leather collar. It was well made, with careful stitching and brass hardware that had once been polished to a shine. The leather was cracked now, weathered by exposure, but Eli could make out faded lettering burned into the leather. He reached for it carefully, aware that Brutus was tracking his every movement. The collar was too large for the German shepherd's neck, suggesting it had belonged to a bigger dog, perhaps a mastiff or Great Dane. But more telling were the scratches and teeth marks that scored the leather. This collar had been through violence, just like everything else in Brutus's world. "Belonged to a friend of yours?" Eli asked softly, holding up the collar so Brutus could see it. The dog's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. His ears drooped and a low whine escaped his throat, not threatening, but mournful. The sound of an animal remembering loss. Eli sat down on the wet ground, ignoring the cold seepage through his clothes. This seemed like a moment that required patience and presence rather than standing authority. "You weren't always alone, were you?" he said, turning the collar over in his hands. "Someone cared for you once. You had a pack." Brutus took a tentative step closer, drawn by something in Eli's voice or perhaps by the sight of the collar. For the first time, he didn't look like he was preparing to fight or flee. He looked like he was remembering. "I had a pack once, too," Eli continued, his voice taking on the reflective quality of a man sharing sacred memories. "A wife named Sarah who could make biscuits that would make angels weep. 2 kids, Jenny and Michael. Jenny had your coloring, you know. Dark hair with golden highlights when the sun hit it just right." The rain continued its steady rhythm overhead, and Brutus settled into a watchful crouch, as if sensing that something important was being shared. "We had a ranch," Eli went on, absently stroking the worn collar. 300 acres of the prettiest land you ever saw. Raised cattle, grew hay, had a couple of horses that the kids loved to ride. It was a good life, a complete life." He paused, lost in memories that brought both comfort and pain. Brutus remained motionless, his amber eyes fixed on Eli's face with an intensity that suggested he understood more than mere words could convey. The drought came in year 3 of our operation. Not unusual out here, you learn to expect lean times. But this one lasted 3 years. 3 years of watching the grass turn brown, the creek dry up, the cattle get thinner and thinner. We sold everything we could, took loans against everything we couldn't. Eli's voice grew quieter, and Brutus actually moved closer, now sitting just 5 feet away, close enough that Eli could have reached out and touched him. Bank foreclosed on the ranch first. Then they came for the house, the furniture, everything, Sarah. She couldn't take watching it all disappear. She took the kids and went to live with her sister in Kansas. Said she'd come back when I got things sorted out. The admission hung in the air like morning mist. Eli had never spoken these words aloud to another soul, but something about Brutus's presence made confession feel necessary, even healing. That was 3 years ago. Haven't heard from them since. Can't say I blame them. What woman wants to be married to a man who can't provide for his family? Brutus tilted his head, a gesture so human-like that it caught Eli off guard. There was no judgment in those amber eyes, only a kind of recognition. Here was another creature who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have everything important torn away without warning. "So here we are," Eli said with a rueful smile. 2 lost souls who don't quite fit anywhere, both carrying scars that nobody else can see. As if responding to some unspoken invitation, Brutus rose from his crouch and moved closer still. Close enough that Eli could smell the wet dog scent of him, could see the intelligence and pain that lived behind his scarred features. Slowly, carefully, Eli extended his hand, palm up, not reaching for the dog, just making himself available. Brutus studied the offered hand for a long moment, then, miracle of miracles, stretched his neck forward and sniffed Eli's fingers. The contact lasted only seconds, but it represented a breakthrough months in the making. When Brutus pulled back, something fundamental had shifted between them. The wall of mistrust hadn't crumbled, but a door had been opened. "There we go," Eli whispered, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" From the street beyond the clinic, voices carried on the rain-dampened air. Eli could make out Doc Whitman talking to someone, possibly Sheriff Morrison. The real world was reasserting itself, reminding both man and dog that their private moment of understanding existed within a larger context of suspicion and fear. "They're going to try to separate us," Eli said quietly, still holding the old collar. "Folks in town don't understand what we're doing here. They see danger where we see healing." Brutus seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He looked toward the street, where the voices continued their conversation. Then back at Eli. Some wordless communication passed between them, a mutual recognition that they had become allies in a world that wanted neither of them. As the rain began to ease, Dr. Whitman's voice grew closer. Brutus rose smoothly to his feet, but he didn't immediately flee as he would have a week ago. Instead, he looked at Eli one more time, as if memorizing his face, then padded silently into the maze of buildings that had become his refuge. Eli remained sitting for several minutes after the dog had gone, still holding the old collar and thinking about the strange turns that life could take. A week ago, he'd been a drifter with no purpose beyond surviving each day. Now he was part of something larger, a partnership built on mutual understanding and shared pain. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was no longer facing them alone. The town council meeting convened on a muggy Friday evening in the schoolhouse, with nearly every adult resident of Willow Creek in attendance. Eli wasn't invited, but he could hear the heated discussions drifting through the open windows as he sat outside on the steps of the general store. Whittling a piece of wood with his pocket knife, Brutus materialized from the shadows around 8 o'clock, settling into a watchful position about 10 feet away. The dog had taken to appearing whenever Eli was still, for more than a few minutes, as if sensing when his human companion might need protection or simply company. "Looks like we're both on trial tonight," Eli murmured, not looking directly at the dog but aware of his presence. "Question is whether the jury's already made up their minds." Through the schoolhouse windows, he could make out Sheriff Morrison's distinctive voice trying to maintain order, while various citizens voiced their concerns. Mrs. Henderson's sharp tones cut through the general hubbub, followed by Doc Whitman's more measured responses. The debate seemed to be growing more heated as the evening progressed. Eli reached into his worn saddlebag and pulled out a faded photograph, its edges soft with handling. The image showed a younger version of himself, standing beside a pretty woman with kind eyes and dark hair. 2 children flanked them, a girl of perhaps 10 with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, and a boy of 7 or 8 who bore an unmistakable resemblance to his father. They stood in front of a modest ranch house, with mountains visible in the background. The very picture of the American dream realized. "That's my Sarah," Eli said quietly, angling the photograph so Brutus could see it. "And that's Jenny and Michael." This was taken the year before everything fell apart. The dog's ears perked forward, and he moved slightly closer, as if drawn by the tenderness in Eli's voice. "Sarah was a schoolteacher before we married. Smartest woman I ever met, and kind as summer rain. She could gentle a wild horse or nurse a sick calf back to health with equal skill. The children adored her." Eli's thumb traced the edge of the photograph. "Still do, I imagine." A burst of angry voices from the schoolhouse interrupted his reverie. Frank Morrison's voice rose above the others, demanding immediate action regarding the dog problem and the vagrant who's encouraging it. Brutus's head turned toward the building, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The dog had learned to associate raised voices with danger, and the hostility directed toward Eli seemed to trigger his protective instincts. "Easy, boy," Eli soothed. "They're just scared. Can't say I blame them entirely." He returned his attention to the photograph, his weathered fingers gentle on the fragile paper. "The funny thing about losing everything is how gradual it is at first, then how sudden at the end. We held on for 3 years, borrowing money, selling off pieces of the ranch, telling ourselves it was temporary. Sarah kept teaching to bring in extra income, and I took work wherever I could find it." The memory brought a rueful smile to his face. "Jenny wanted to help by selling her horse, a little paint mare she'd raised from a foal. Nearly broke my heart when she offered. That's when I knew we were really in trouble." Brutus had crept closer during the story, now sitting just beyond arm's reach. His amber eyes remained fixed on Eli's face, as if he could sense the pain that accompanied these memories. "The bank came on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember because Sarah was making apple preserves, and the whole house smelled like cinnamon and sugar. Mr. Peterson from the bank, he was decent about it, apologetic even, but business is business, and we were 3 months behind on our payments." Eli paused, overcome by the vivid recollection of that terrible morning. Sarah standing in the kitchen doorway with flour on her apron, the children getting ready for school, none of them understanding that their world was about to end. Sarah packed the kids up that same afternoon, said she couldn't watch them lose their home, couldn't bear to see them go without. Her sister in Kansas had offered to take them in until we could get back on our feet. His voice cracked slightly. I told her it would just be for a few months. A year at most. From the schoolhouse came the sound of chairs scraping against wood floors and footsteps moving about. The meeting seemed to be breaking up, which meant decisions had likely been reached. 3 years, Eli continued, needing to finish the story now that he'd started it. 3 years of drifting from town to town, taking whatever work I could find, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings. I sent letters at first, but they came back unopened. Sarah's sister probably thought it was best to make a clean break. He looked down at the photograph, studying the faces of the family he'd lost through his own inability to protect them. Can't say she was wrong. What kind of man lets his family slip away like that? A footstep crunched on gravel behind him, and Eli turned to see Dr. Whitman approaching. The physician moved slowly, deliberately, his medical bag in one hand and his walking stick in the other. Brutus tensed at the newcomer's approach, but he didn't flee. "Meeting's over," Doc Whitman said, settling onto the steps beside Eli with a weary sigh. "Figured you might want to know the outcome. I'm listening." Mixed verdict. "Half the town wants you and the dog gone by Sunday. The other half thinks what you're doing with him shows promise." The doctor glanced at Brutus, who was watching the exchange with keen interest. "Morrison managed to table any immediate action, but the pressure's building." Eli nodded, having expected as much. "What do you think, Doc?" "I think that dog's been showing remarkable improvement since you started working with him. Mrs. Patterson told me he walked past her children yesterday without so much as a growl." "That's progress." Whitman adjusted his spectacles. "I also think the town's got bigger problems than one stray dog and one decent man trying to help him." The doctor's words carried more weight than he might have realized. In frontier communities, the physician's opinion often influenced public sentiment almost as much as the sheriff's or the preacher's. "Appreciate that, Doc. Don't thank me yet. Frank Morrison's talking about bringing in the territorial marshal if the sheriff won't act. Claims the dog represents a public safety hazard that requires outside intervention. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Territorial marshals had broad authority and little patience for local complexities. If one arrived in Willow Creek, both Eli and Brutus would likely find themselves with no options beyond fleeing or facing consequences neither was prepared for. As if sensing the gravity of the conversation, Brutus rose to his feet and moved closer to Eli, not close enough to touch, but close enough to offer whatever protection his presence might provide. The gesture wasn't lost on Dr. Whitman, who observed the dog's behavior with professional interest. "Remarkable," the doctor murmured. "He's appointed himself your guardian, hasn't he?" Eli looked at the scarred German shepherd, remembering the vicious animal that had terrorized the town just weeks ago. The transformation was indeed remarkable, but it was far from complete. Both of them still carried wounds that might never fully heal. "We're looking out for each other," Eli said simply. "Sometimes that's all you can do." As the doctor took his leave, and the last stragglers from the town meeting headed home, Eli remained on the steps with his unlikely companion. The photograph lay open in his lap, a reminder of everything he'd lost, and everything he was still fighting to find again. Somewhere in Kansas, his family was living a life that no longer included him. But here in Willow Creek, a damaged dog had chosen to trust him, and in that trust, Eli was beginning to remember what it felt like to be worthy of someone's faith. Sheriff Morrison found Eli at dawn on Monday morning, sitting by the creek that ran behind the livery stable. Brutus lay nearby, no longer the tense, hyper-vigilant animal he'd been weeks ago, but relaxed enough to rest while remaining alert to his surroundings. The transformation was undeniable, but Morrison carried the weight of his office like a stone in his chest. "Mind if I sit?" Morrison asked, gesturing toward a fallen log that served as a makeshift bench. Eli nodded, and the sheriff settled beside him with a heavy sigh. Morrison's badge caught the early morning light, a simple star-shaped piece of tin that had been worn smooth by years of handling. The badge represented law and order, civilization's attempt to impose structure on the chaos of frontier life. But looking at it now, Eli saw it as something else, a symbol of the authority that would soon force him to make an impossible choice. "Pretty morning," Morrison said, though his tone suggested he wasn't there to discuss the weather. "They are out here," Eli agreed. "Peaceful, Brutus lifted his head at the sound of conversation but remained where he was. The dog had learned to read human moods with uncanny accuracy, and he seemed to sense that this conversation carried weight. "Eli, I need to be straight with you," Morrison began, his fingers unconsciously worrying the edge of his badge. "Frank's been pressuring me all weekend about taking action. He's threatened to wire the territorial capital if I don't resolve this situation by week's end." "What situation would that be?" Morrison looked at him sharply, then realized Eli wasn't being facetious. "The dog, Eli, the town's patience has run out." "Has it now?" Eli's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Funny thing about patience. Seems like it's in short supply when folks are comfortable, but when they really need it, they find reserves they didn't know they had. This isn't about philosophy," Morrison said, though not unkindly. "It's about public safety, about people feeling secure in their own community." Eli watched Brutus, who was now sitting up and watching the sheriff with wary intelligence. The dog's protective instincts had been steadily growing stronger, and he seemed to sense that Morrison represented a threat to the fragile peace they'd built. "Tell me something, Sheriff," Eli said. "When's the last time that dog hurt anyone?" Morrison paused, clearly thinking. "Well, there was the incident with Billy Patterson. That was 6 weeks ago, before we started working together." "What about since then?" The silence stretched long enough to be meaningful. Morrison shifted uncomfortably on the log, his badge glinting in the strengthening sunlight. "There haven't been any incidents," Morrison admitted reluctantly. "And when's the last time he threatened anyone? Growled at a child? Scared someone's livestock?" Again, the sheriff had no ready answer. The truth was that Brutus's behavior had improved dramatically, but fear was a stubborn emotion that didn't yield easily to facts. "The thing is, Eli, it doesn't matter if he's been peaceful lately. People remember how he was. They're afraid that if you leave town, or if something happens to you, he'll go back to being dangerous." It was a fair concern, Eli had to admit. The bond between him and Brutus was real, but it was also fragile. The dog's trust was built on consistent, gentle treatment, and there was no guarantee that anyone else could maintain the relationship they'd forged. "So what are you proposing?" Morrison's hand moved to his badge again, a nervous habit that spoke of the weight he carried as the law in a community where compromise wasn't always possible. "I need you to make a choice, Eli. Either you take the dog and leave Willow Creek by Sunday, or you let me handle the situation in a way that ensures public safety." The euphemism hung in the air between them. Both men knew what handling the situation meant in practical terms. Brutus would be shot, and Eli would be expected to understand that it was for the greater good. "How long have you been sheriff, Morrison?" The question seemed to catch Morrison off guard. 12 years? Why?" "That's a long time to carry that badge. Must have been some difficult decisions over the years. More than I care to count." Eli picked up a stone and skipped it across the creek's slow-moving water. "You ever make one you regretted?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his eyes following the stone's path across the water. "A few," he said finally. "This feel like it might be one of those." The sheriff's hand closed around his badge, and Eli could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. Morrison was a good man, caught between his conscience and his duty, between what felt right and what seemed necessary. "I don't want to do this, Eli," Morrison said finally. "I've seen what you've accomplished with that dog. Hell, half the time I forget he was ever dangerous. But Frank's got the town council behind him, and if I don't act, they'll bring in someone who will." Brutus rose to his feet and moved closer to Eli, as if sensing the tension in the conversation. The dog positioned himself between Eli and Morrison, not aggressively but protectively. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about the bond they'd formed. "Look at him, Sheriff," Eli said quietly. "Really look at him. Does that look like a dangerous animal to you?" Morrison studied Brutus, taking in the dog's alert but calm demeanor, the way he positioned himself to protect without threatening. The transformation was remarkable, undeniable even to someone determined to see danger. "No," Morrison admitted. "He doesn't." "But no buts," Eli interrupted gently. Either he's dangerous or he's not. Either trust means something or it doesn't. Either redemption is possible or it's just a word we use to make ourselves feel better about giving up on things. The sheriff stood up, his decision clearly weighing heavily on his shoulders. He looked down at his badge one more time, then back at Eli and Brutus. "You've got until Sunday," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, but that's the best I can do." After Morrison left, Eli remained by the creek, with Brutus settled beside him. The dog seemed to understand that something significant had just occurred, some threat to their peaceful existence that would require a response. "Well, boy," Eli said, running his fingers through Brutus's thick fur, a gesture that would have been impossible just weeks ago. "Looks like we've got ourselves a deadline." Brutus leaned into the touch, a rumbling sound of contentment emerging from his chest. For a dog that had known little but violence and abandonment, this simple act of affection represented a miracle of healing. "Question is," Eli continued, "what are we going to do about it?" The sun climbed higher, warming the morning air and setting the creek water sparkling like scattered diamonds. In the distance, Willow Creek was beginning to stir to life, its citizens unaware that in 5 days they would force one of their own to make a choice that would define not just his future, but theirs as well. Eli pulled the faded photograph from his pocket and studied the faces of his lost family. Sarah's kind eyes seemed to look back at him across the years, and he could almost hear her voice asking the question that had haunted him since that terrible October morning. What kind of man lets the things he loves slip away without a fight? Maybe it was time to find out what kind of man he'd become. Dr. Whitman found the train ticket by accident. He'd come to the livery stable Tuesday evening to treat a mare with a stone bruise, and while waiting for Joe Murphy to bring his payment, the wind had caught some papers from Eli's saddlebag, scattering them across the stable floor. The doctor had helped gather them up, a kind gesture from one gentleman to another, but as he handed the papers back, one particular item caught his eye. It was a train ticket dated 3 months ago, departure point Kansas City, destination Millfield Junction, the nearest rail stop to Willow Creek. But it wasn't the ticket itself that made Dr. Whitman's breath catch. It was the name printed on it, Elijah Boone Patterson. Patterson, the same name as the family whose boy had been cornered by Brutus weeks ago. The same name that appeared on the deed to the largest ranch in the county, owned by a family that had arrived just 2 years before Eli's appearance in town. "Eli," Dr. Whitman said carefully, holding up the ticket, "I think you dropped this." Eli's face went very still as he recognized what the doctor was holding. For a long moment, the only sounds in the stable were the gentle movements of horses and the distant barking of dogs. Finally, Eli took the ticket and studied it as if seeing it for the first time. "I suppose you have questions," Eli said quietly. "1 or 2. Eli folded the ticket carefully and placed it back in his saddlebag. When he looked up, his eyes held the weight of a man who'd been carrying secrets for too long. "Billy Patterson is my grandson." The words hit Dr. Whitman like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about Eli Boone, the drifter, the vagrant, the mysterious cowboy who'd appeared in their town with nothing but heartache and an ability to calm dangerous animals, suddenly shifted into a new configuration. "Your grandson," Dr. Whitman repeated, his physician's mind already working through the implications. "Sarah remarried," Eli said, settling onto a bale of hay with the weariness of a man finally ready to unburden himself. "Found herself a good man named Patterson who could provide for her and the children." "Good man," he repeated as if trying to convince himself. "Better man than I was anyway." Brutus, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, moved closer to Eli and settled at his feet. The dog's presence seemed to give Eli the strength to continue. "I tracked them down about 6 months ago. Took me 2 years of searching, following rumors and asking questions in every town between here and Kansas. When I finally found them, they'd been in Willow Creek for almost 2 years. Sarah was Mrs. Patterson now, mother to Billy and his sister Emma. They had a ranch, a real life. Stability." Dr. Whitman found himself thinking of young Billy Patterson, a bright boy of 8, with his mother's kind eyes, and, now that he knew to look for it, something of Eli's stubborn chin. "They don't know you're here." "No," Eli's voice was barely above a whisper. "I came to see them, to make things right somehow. But when I arrived and saw how happy they were, how settled, I couldn't bring myself to disrupt that. So I stayed on the outskirts, took odd jobs, tried to figure out what kind of man approaches a family that's moved on without him." The revelation cast everything in a new light. Eli's gentle way with animals, his patience, his understanding of broken things. These weren't just the traits of a wandering cowboy, but of a man who'd once been a father and husband, who still carried that identity somewhere deep inside, despite all evidence to the contrary. "The day Brutus cornered Billy," Eli continued, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap, "I was watching from across the street, saw my grandson backed against that wall, terrified, and I couldn't move. Couldn't reveal myself to save him, because doing so would destroy the life his mother had built. But you did save him in a way," Dr. Whitman said gently, "by teaching that dog to trust again." "Did I? Or did I just find another broken thing to fix because I couldn't fix the one that mattered most?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of 3 years' worth of regret and longing. Dr. Whitman began to understand the true nature of Eli's relationship with Brutus. It wasn't just about healing a damaged animal, but about finding a way to be the protector he'd failed to be for his own family. "Does Patterson know?" Dr. Whitman asked. "About me?" "No. Sarah never told him about her first husband, as far as I can tell. Probably easier that way." Eli's smile was bitter with self-recrimination. "Who wants to explain that your wife's first husband was too weak to hold on to what mattered?" Brutus whined softly and pressed closer to Eli, as if trying to offer comfort for pain the dog couldn't fully understand. The gesture wasn't lost on either man. "That dog knows you're hurting," Dr. Whitman observed. "Animals have a sense for these things. Maybe that's why we understand each other," Eli said, running his fingers through Brutus's fur. "We're both trying to figure out how to live with the consequences of our failures." The stable door opened, and Joe Murphy entered, followed by an unexpected visitor, Robert Patterson himself. Billy's stepfather was a tall, solid man in his 40s, with the confident bearing of someone who'd built something worthwhile with his life. He nodded politely to Dr. Whitman, then turned his attention to Eli. "Mr. Boone, I'm Robert Patterson. I believe we need to talk." Eli's face went pale, but he stood to meet the other man's gaze. "Mr. Patterson, I know who you are," Patterson said without preamble. "Sarah told me about her first husband years ago. When I heard about a man named Boone working with that German shepherd, it didn't take much to put the pieces together. The confrontation that Eli had been dreading for months was finally at hand." Dr. Whitman started to excuse himself, but Patterson gestured for him to stay. "This concerns the whole town." "Doc, might as well hear it all." Patterson turned back to Eli, his expression unreadable. "Sarah knows you're here." "Has known for weeks. Billy described the man who calmed the dog, and she recognized your voice in his description. I never meant to what? To care about your grandson from a distance, to make sure he was safe without disrupting his life." Patterson's tone wasn't angry, but it was firm. "You've been protecting my family for months, Mr. Boone. Did you think we wouldn't notice?" The admission left Eli speechless. All his careful planning, his determination to remain invisible, had been undone by a mother's intuition and a stepfather's awareness. "Sarah wants to see you," Patterson continued. "Not to take the children away, not to undo what we've built, but to find a way for you to be part of their lives again. They need to know their real father didn't abandon them. He loved them enough to let them go." Eli sank back onto the hay bale, overwhelmed by the possibility that forgiveness might exist where he'd expected only rejection. Brutus moved to sit directly in front of him, offering the comfort of his presence, while Eli processed this unexpected turn. "And the dog?" Eli asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Patterson smiled, the first genuine warmth he'd shown since entering the stable. Sarah says any man who can turn a monster into a guardian is exactly the kind of influence she wants around her children. Besides, Billy's been asking about the dog man every day since the incident. Thinks you're some kind of hero. Dr. Whitman watched this exchange with growing understanding. The town's crisis wasn't just about a dangerous animal or a vagrant causing trouble. It was about family, forgiveness, and the possibility that broken things could indeed be mended with enough patience and love. There's something else, Patterson added. Frank Morrison's been spreading word about bringing in the territorial marshal. But if you were to become part of a respected family in this community, if you had a legitimate place here, that changes the whole situation. The train ticket that had seemed like evidence of deception now revealed itself as proof of love. A father's desperate journey to be near the children he'd lost, even if only from a distance. And the dangerous dog that had terrorized the town had become the bridge that might reunite a fractured family. As the three men stood in the gathering dusk, with Brutus alert and protective at Eli's side, the future of Willow Creek seemed to balance on the edge of possibility. Sometimes redemption came not through grand gestures, but through the simple recognition that everyone deserved a second chance, even those who believed they'd forfeited that right long ago. The emergency town meeting was called for Thursday evening, giving the community less than 24 hours to process the revelation that had swept through Willow Creek like wildfire. Eli Boone wasn't just a vagrant. He was Sarah Patterson's first husband, Billy and Emma's biological father, and a man whose presence in their town suddenly carried implications none of them had considered. Eli spent Wednesday night at the Patterson Ranch for the first time in 3 years, sitting around a kitchen table that smelled of fresh bread and coffee, trying to reconcile the children he remembered with the young people they'd become. Billy had grown tall and serious, with Sarah's thoughtful eyes but Eli's stubborn jawline. Emma, now 13, possessed a quiet strength that reminded Eli painfully of her mother at that age. Sarah herself had aged gracefully, though Eli could see new lines around her eyes that spoke of worries he'd been absent to share. She moved through her kitchen with the efficient grace of a woman who'd learned to build a life from determination and love. Robert Patterson watching her with the devotion of a man who understood what a gift he'd been given. "I need you to understand something," Sarah said to Eli as the children helped clear the dinner dishes. "I'm not the woman you married anymore. These aren't the children you raised. We've all changed, grown, become different people. I know that," Eli replied, though the words felt inadequate. "Do you? Because the man I married had a tendency to see what he wanted to see, to believe that good intentions could fix anything." Sarah's voice wasn't unkind, but it was direct. "I won't let you break their hearts again." Eli, not even with the best of intentions, the warning was clear, and Eli accepted it with the humility of a man who'd learned the difference between wanting redemption and earning it. But across the room, Brutus lay peacefully beside the fireplace, and in the dog's calm presence, Eli found a reminder of what was possible when broken trust was rebuilt slowly, carefully, with actions rather than words. Thursday morning brought Frank Morrison to the ranch, his face flushed with anger and his hand resting on his gun butt in a way that made Brutus rise from his place by Eli's side. "This doesn't change anything," Frank declared, though his eyes darted nervously toward the German shepherd. "Vagrant or family man, that dog's still dangerous. And you're still harboring him against the community's wishes." Robert Patterson stepped forward, his own considerable frame making Frank Morrison look smaller by comparison. "That dog is on my property, with my family, and shows no signs of aggression. What business is it of yours?" "Public safety is everyone's business," Frank shot back, but his voice lacked conviction. The moral authority he'd claimed when arguing against a homeless drifter crumbled when faced with a property owner defending his rights. "Then maybe we should let the public decide," Sarah suggested quietly, "rather than a handful of men making choices for everyone else." It was this suggestion that had led to the emergency town meeting, scheduled for that evening in the schoolhouse. Word had spread quickly through Willow Creek, some residents excited by the family drama, others concerned about the precedent of accepting dangerous animals based on personal circumstances. Dr. Whitman visited the ranch that afternoon, carrying his medical bag and wearing an expression of grave concern. He found Eli in the barn, grooming one of Patterson's horses, while Brutus watched from a pile of fresh hay. "How are you feeling, Eli?" the doctor asked, settling onto a wooden crate. "This must be overwhelming." "Some," Eli admitted, running the curry comb along the horse's flank. "Feels strange being around family again." "Good strange, but strange. And the meeting tonight?" Eli paused in his grooming. "What about it?" Dr. Whitman reached into his medical bag and withdrew a small brown bottle, holding it up so Eli could see the label. The bottle contained laudanum, a tincture of opium, commonly used for pain relief, but dangerous in large doses. "This belonged to Frank Morrison," the doctor said carefully. "I found it in his coat when I treated him for a fall last week." "The bottle was full then. Now it's nearly empty." Eli set down the curry comb and turned to face the doctor. "What are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying that Frank's been acting erratically lately. More aggressive, less rational. Laudanum can do that to a man, especially if he's taking more than prescribed." Dr. Whitman's voice was heavy with professional concern. "I'm also saying that a man under the influence of opiates might do something rash at tonight's meeting, something he'd regret when the drug wore off." The implication was clear. Frank Morrison wasn't just opposed to Eli and Brutus on principle. He was compromised by addiction, his judgment clouded by chemicals that made rational decision-making nearly impossible. "Why are you telling me this?" Eli asked. "Because I took an oath to do no harm, and I'm afraid Frank's condition might lead to harm for everyone involved, including your family." That evening, the schoolhouse was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding around the open windows. Eli sat in the front row beside Robert and Sarah, with Billy and Emma flanked by their parents. Brutus lay at Eli's feet, his presence a visible reminder of the question before the community. Sheriff Morrison called the meeting to order, though his brother Frank kept interrupting with increasingly agitated demands for immediate action. The other man's behavior was clearly abnormal, his pupils dilated, his speech slightly slurred, his movements jerky and unpredictable. "The question before us is simple," Sheriff Morrison said, trying to maintain order. "Do we accept Mr. Boone and his dog as part of our community, or do we require them to leave?" "There's nothing to discuss," Frank Morrison shouted, jumping to his feet. "A dangerous animal is a dangerous animal no matter who claims it. What happens when it turns on one of those children?" Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher, stood to respond. "That dog has been around children for weeks without incident. If anything, he seems protective of them." "Protective now, maybe," Frank continued, his voice rising to near hysteria. "But what about tomorrow? What about when something triggers his killer instincts?" Dr. Whitman rose slowly, his medical bag in his hand. "Frank, perhaps you should sit down. You seem agitated. Don't you dare try to doctor me." Frank snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "This is about public safety, not medicine." The gesture sent a ripple of alarm through the crowd. Children began to cry, and several men moved protectively in front of their families. But it was Brutus who responded most dramatically. The dog had been calm throughout the meeting, but Frank's aggressive posture and the scent of fear from the crowd triggered something primal in his protective instincts. He rose to his feet with a low growl, positioning himself between Frank and the Patterson family. "You see?" Frank shouted triumphantly, though his voice carried an edge of panic. "You see what happens? That beast is ready to attack." But those who looked closely could see that Brutus wasn't preparing to attack. He was preparing to defend. His stance was protective rather than aggressive. His attention focused entirely on the man whose erratic behavior had marked him as a potential threat. "Frank," Sheriff Morrison said carefully, "I need you to calm down and take your seat. I'll calm down when that animal is dead and buried." Frank's hand closed around his gun butt, and the crowd gasped collectively. That's when Eli stood up. "Nobody's dying here tonight," he said quietly. his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced worse situations and survived them. "Frank, you're not well. Let Doc Whitman help you. I don't need help. I need that dog destroyed and you run out of town." Frank Morrison's hand tightened on his weapon, and for a moment the future of Willow Creek balanced on the edge of violence. But as he began to draw his gun, Brutus did something remarkable. Instead of attacking, the dog moved slowly, deliberately, placing himself directly between Frank and the children. He sat down, faced the armed man, and waited. Not aggressive, not submissive, but simply present. A living wall of determination that said more clearly than words, "You'll have to go through me first." The gesture broke something in Frank Morrison. Faced with the calm courage of the animal he'd been determined to destroy, he seemed to see his own reflection in those amber eyes, the reflection of a man driven by fear and chemical dependency to threaten everything good in his world. His hand fell away from his gun, and he collapsed into his chair, the laudanum's effects finally overwhelming his ability to maintain his aggression. Dr. Whitman moved quickly to his side, checking his pulse and pupils while speaking in low, soothing tones. "The meeting's over," Sheriff Morrison announced, though his eyes remained fixed on his brother with a mixture of grief and understanding. "We'll reconvene when everyone's had time to think about what we've seen here tonight." As the crowd dispersed, many of them stopped to look at Brutus with new eyes. The dog, who had once terrorized their community, had just risked his life to protect their children from one of their own. Whatever decision they ultimately made about his fate, they could no longer claim he was simply a dangerous animal without conscience or loyalty. Eli remained seated until the schoolhouse emptied, Sarah's hand resting gently on his shoulder, while Billy and Emma studied their father's companion with a mixture of awe and understanding. Sometimes the measure of a soul wasn't found in its past mistakes, but in its willingness to stand between innocence and harm. Even when doing so might cost everything, the final confrontation was still to come. But tonight had changed the fundamental question facing Willow Creek. It was no longer about whether they could trust a dangerous dog. It was about whether they could rise to the level of courage and loyalty that dog had just demonstrated. The territorial marshal arrived on the Friday morning train, 3 days earlier than anyone had expected. Word traveled fast through Willow Creek, a tall man in a dark coat carrying federal authority and a reputation for decisive action. Frank Morrison had managed to send his wire despite his brother's attempts to intervene. And now the consequences were walking down Main Street with purposeful strides. Eli was splitting wood behind the Patterson Ranch when young Billy came running from town, his face flushed with urgency and fear. "Papa Eli," the boy called, using the name they'd settled on the night before. "There's a marshal in town asking about you and Brutus." The axe froze mid-swing in Eli's hands. Brutus, who had been dozing in the morning sun, immediately came alert, sensing the tension that suddenly filled the air. The dog moved to Billy's side, offering comfort to the frightened child while keeping his eyes fixed on Eli's face. "What kind of questions is he asking?" Eli said, setting the axe aside carefully. "Sheriff Morrison's with him. They're going door to door, asking people about incidents with the dog. Frank Morrison's telling everyone who'll listen that you're harboring a dangerous animal that attacked him last night." Eli cursed under his breath. Frank's version of events would paint Brutus as an aggressor rather than a protector, and a territorial marshal wouldn't have the benefit of witnessing the transformation that had taken place over the past months. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the ranch house, her face pale but determined. "Robert's saddling horses," she called. "We need to get into town before this situation gets worse." But even as they prepared to leave, the sound of hoofbeats announced that the situation was coming to them. Marshal David Crane rode into the ranch yard, flanked by Sheriff Morrison and 3 deputies, his badge catching the sunlight like a promise of swift justice. He was a man in his 40s, with steel-gray eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mr. Boone," Marshal Crane said, dismounting with fluid efficiency, "I'm here to investigate reports of a dangerous animal and public safety violations. I'll need you to surrender the dog immediately." Brutus stepped forward, placing himself between the marshal and Eli's family. The dog's stance was alert but not aggressive, protective rather than threatening. Still, the marshal's hand moved instinctively toward his side arm. "Easy, Marshal," Eli said quickly. "He's not going to hurt anyone." "That's not for you to decide," Crane replied, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "I have sworn statements that this animal has terrorized the community and attacked citizens. Standard procedure is immediate destruction of the threat, based on whose statements?" Robert Patterson stepped forward, his own considerable presence adding weight to the question. "Because I can provide testimony that directly contradicts those claims." Marshal Crane consulted a notebook from his coat pocket. Frank Morrison, Tom Bradley, Carl Henley. "All respected members of the community who've documented multiple incidents of aggressive behavior. All incidents that occurred before Mr. Boone began working with the animal," Sarah interjected, moving to stand beside her husband. "There have been no problems since then. Ma'am, with respect, the past behavior of a dangerous animal is exactly what we use to predict future behavior. A wolf doesn't stop being a wolf just because someone feeds it." The comparison stung, but Eli forced himself to remain calm. This was the moment he'd been dreading, when all the progress, all the healing, all the careful trust-building would be measured against the cold equations of law and public safety. "Marshal," Eli said carefully, "what would it take to convince you that this dog poses no threat?" Crane studied him with calculating eyes. "Nothing. My job isn't to rehabilitate animals, it's to protect communities. But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll give you 10 minutes to say your goodbyes, and then I'll handle this as humanely as possible." The pronouncement hit like a physical blow. Billy began to cry, and Emma wrapped her arms around Brutus, who remained stoically calm, despite the emotional storm surrounding him. Sarah's face went white, and Robert's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "No," Eli said quietly. The single word carried such finality that everyone in the yard froze. Marshal Crane's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he wasn't accustomed to being refused. "I beg your pardon." "I said no." Eli's voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of every loss he'd endured, every mistake he'd made, every second chance he'd squandered. "You want that dog? You'll have to go through me first." Behind the marshal, Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Eli, don't make this harder than it has to be. It's already hard, Sheriff. Question is whether we're going to let hardness turn us into something we don't recognize." Marshal Crane's expression grew cold. "Mr. Boone, you're interfering with a federal investigation. Step aside, or I'll place you under arrest." That's when Eli noticed something that made his blood run cold. Behind the house, barely visible through the trees, a small wooden cross marked the grave of a dog the Patterson family had lost the previous winter. The cross was simple, hand-carved, bearing only the name Ranger, and the dates of a life cut short by accident rather than malice. The sight of that grave marker crystallized everything for Eli. How many good things had been lost to fear, to the unwillingness to take risks for love? How many lives had been sacrificed on the altar of what seemed safe and practical? "Marshal," Eli said, his voice carrying a new note of certainty, "I'm not just protecting a dog. I'm protecting the idea that redemption is possible, that broken things can be mended, that trust once lost can be rebuilt. If you destroy that, you destroy something in this community that can never be replaced." Brutus seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The dog moved to Eli's side and sat, not in submission, but in solidarity. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "I've heard enough," Marshal Crane said, drawing his weapon. "Stand aside, Mr. Boone. That's a direct order." The gun's appearance sent a shock through everyone present, but Eli didn't move. Instead, he placed his hand on Brutus's head, feeling the warmth and solidity of the life he was determined to protect. "Then you'll have to shoot me too," Eli said simply. "Because I'm not moving." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, federal authority facing down a father's love. The law confronting the possibility that some things mattered more than regulations and procedure. In that moment, the future of Willow, Creek and everyone in it balanced on the edge of a decision that would define what kind of community they truly were. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the deadly stillness that had settled over the Patterson ranch. Dr. Whitman rode into the yard at a pace that spoke of urgency, followed by an unexpected assemblage: Mrs. Henderson, Murphy from the livery stable, and nearly 24 other townspeople, including several children who should have been in school. "Marshal Crane," Dr. Whitman called, dismounting with the careful movements of a man his age. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this situation." The federal lawman kept his weapon trained on Eli, but turned his head slightly to acknowledge the newcomer. "Doctor, this is federal business. I'll ask you to stand clear." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Dr. Whitman replied, moving to stand beside Eli and Brutus. "Not when you're about to destroy something this community needs. What this community needs is protection from dangerous animals," Marshal Crane said. Though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her schoolteacher's authority lending weight to her words. "Marshal, I've been watching that dog interact with my students for weeks. If he were truly dangerous, would I bring children here?" As if to underscore her point, young Billy Patterson broke away from his mother and wrapped his arms around Brutus's neck. The dog remained perfectly still, accepting the child's embrace with gentle patience. "Children don't always understand danger," the marshal said. But his gun hand had begun to waver. "No," said Murphy, joining the growing circle around Eli and Brutus. "But adults do. And every adult in this town has seen the change in that animal." One by one, the townspeople began to speak, not just defending Brutus, but telling the story of his transformation. They spoke of a dog who had learned to trust again, who protected rather than threatened, who had become a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to give up on a damaged soul. Marshal Crane found himself facing not just one defiant man, but an entire community united in protection of something they'd come to value. His federal authority seemed suddenly less absolute in the face of such unified opposition. "This is highly irregular," he said, though his weapon was now pointed toward the ground. "So is redemption," Eli replied quietly. "But that doesn't make it less real." Sheriff Morrison, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally stepped forward. "Marshal, I've been watching the situation develop for months. If I believed there was a genuine threat to public safety, I would have acted long ago. Your brother filed a complaint." "My brother is struggling with laudanum addiction," Morrison interrupted, the admission clearly painful but necessary. "His judgment has been compromised for weeks. Dr. Whitman can confirm this." The doctor nodded gravely. "Frank Morrison is not a reliable witness at this time. His perception of events has been significantly altered by chemical dependency." Marshal Crane lowered his weapon completely, though he didn't holster it. "Even so, federal law is clear about dangerous animals. My authority supersedes local sentiment." That's when Sarah Patterson spoke, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had carried her through years of hardship and loss. "Marshal, my son was the child who was supposedly threatened by this dog. If anyone has the right to demand his destruction, it would be me." She moved to stand beside Billy, her hand resting on Brutus's head. "Instead, I'm asking you to see what we see, a creature who has earned his place in our community through the content of his character, not the circumstances of his past." The federal lawman looked around the assembled group, taking in the faces of people who had traveled miles to stand between him and his duty. Children who should have been afraid of Brutus instead sat beside him in the grass. Adults who had once called for his destruction now formed a protective circle around him. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marshal Crane asked finally. Dr. Whitman reached into his medical bag and withdrew something unexpected, a new leather collar, beautifully crafted with brass fittings that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Engraved on a brass nameplate were the words, "Brutus Boone Patterson, Willow Creek." "We're proposing that this dog be officially recognized as a member of this family and this community," the doctor said, offering the collar to Eli, "with all the rights and protections that status entails." Eli accepted the collar with hands that trembled slightly. The leather was supple and new, unmarked by violence or trauma. It represented everything Brutus had never had: belonging, acceptance, a place in the world where he was valued rather than feared. "Will you accept this?" Eli asked Brutus, holding up the collar. "Will you accept a life where you belong somewhere?" The dog looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, then at the circle of people who had chosen to stand with them. Slowly, deliberately, Brutus lowered his head, allowing Eli to place the new collar around his neck. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. This wasn't just about accepting a piece of leather and brass. It was about accepting a new identity, a new way of being in the world. Marshal Crane holstered his weapon with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "An entire community willing to vouch for an animal's character." "Not just an animal," Eli said, adjusting the collar so it sat comfortably on Brutus's neck. "A family member." The marshal studied the scene for a long moment, the dog sitting calmly among the children, the adults whose faces showed not fear but pride, the collar that proclaimed Brutus's official place in their world. "I suppose," Marshal Crane said slowly, "there's nothing in federal law that prohibits a community from accepting responsibility for a reformed animal, especially when that animal is properly licensed and collared." The collective sigh of relief from the assembled townspeople was audible. Children began to cheer, and more than one adult wiped away tears they hadn't realized they were shedding. As the federal lawman prepared to leave, he paused beside Eli. "You risked everything for that dog," he observed. "Why?" Eli looked down at Brutus, who was accepting congratulations from the children with patient dignity. "Because somebody had to believe he was worth saving. And once you start believing that about one broken thing, it gets easier to believe it about others." The transformation was complete. Brutus was no longer the dangerous outcast who had terrorized Willow Creek. He was a member of the Boone-Patterson family, wearing his new collar with quiet pride and surrounded by a community that had chosen love over fear, redemption over revenge. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't won through violence or force, but through the simple act of refusing to give up on the possibility that broken things could heal and lost souls could find their way home. 6 months later, Eli stood in the doorway of the small cabin he'd built on the edge of the Patterson ranch, watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. The cabin was modest, 2 rooms and a covered porch, but it was his. He built with his own hands and the help of neighbors who had once viewed him as an unwelcome stranger. Above the door hung a hand-carved wooden sign that Robert Patterson had crafted as a housewarming gift. The sign read "Boone and Brutus" in careful, honest lettering, and beneath it, in smaller script, "All souls welcome." It had become something of a local landmark, a reminder of the transformation that was possible when a community chose grace over judgment. Brutus emerged from the cabin behind him, the German shepherd's coat gleaming with health and contentment. The dog wore his collar with quiet dignity, the brass nameplate now bearing the patina of daily wear, the leather soft and comfortable against his neck. The scars were still there, the torn ear that would never heal completely, but they had become part of his story rather than the whole of it. "Morning, boy," Eli said, running his fingers through the dog's thick fur. "Ready for another day?" Their morning routine had become a comfortable ritual. First, they would check on the small herd of horses that Eli now trained for neighboring ranches. His reputation for working with difficult animals had grown steadily, built on patience rather than force, understanding rather than domination. Word had spread beyond Willow Creek, and he now had more work than he could handle. After the horses, they would walk to the main house, where Sarah would have breakfast waiting, not out of obligation, but from the simple pleasure of having family together around a table. The children had adapted to their expanded family with the resilience of youth. Though it had taken months to navigate the complex emotions of reconnection, Billy, now 9, had appointed himself Brutus's official caretaker, taking responsibility for the dog's meals and grooming with the seriousness of a child entrusted with something precious. Emma, approaching 14, had inherited her mother's gift for seeing past surface appearances to the heart of things. She'd been the first to call Eli Papa again, a gesture that had nearly brought him to his knees with gratitude. The relationship with Sarah remained complex, built on shared history and mutual respect rather than romantic love. They were partners in raising their children, friends who had learned to forgive each other's failures, but they weren't husband and wife. Robert Patterson held that role with grace and generosity, understanding that love wasn't diminished by being shared among those who deserved it. As Eli and Brutus made their way toward the main house, they passed the small cemetery where the family's previous dog, Ranger, lay buried beneath his simple wooden cross. Brutus always paused there, as if paying respects to the companion he'd never known, but whose place in the family he'd inherited. The town had changed too, in ways both subtle and profound. Dr. Whitman had established a small clinic for treating animals alongside his human patients, inspired by what he'd witnessed of the healing power of the human-animal bond. Mrs. Henderson had incorporated lessons about empathy and second chances into her curriculum, using Brutus's story as an example of how fear could be overcome through understanding. Even Frank Morrison had found his way back to health, though the path had been difficult. His brother had arranged for treatment of his laudanum addiction, and Frank had spent months confronting the demons that had driven him to seek chemical escape. His first public appearance after treatment had been to formally apologize to Eli and Brutus, an act of humility that had meant more than any grand gesture. Sheriff Morrison had been re-elected by the largest margin in the county's history, his handling of the crisis having demonstrated the kind of leadership that frontier communities needed: firm but fair, principled but compassionate. Murphy's livery stable had become an unofficial community center where folks gathered to share coffee and conversation. The back corner, where Eli had once slept on horse blankets, now housed a small library of books donated by families throughout the region, creating a space where knowledge could be shared among those hungry for learning. As Eli approached the main house, he could hear the sounds of family life, Sarah humming as she worked in the kitchen, Robert discussing the day's ranch work with his foreman, the children's voices mixing in the comfortable chaos of morning preparations. "There they are," Sarah called, spotting Eli and Brutus through the kitchen window. "Billy, Emma, breakfast." The children thundered down the stairs with the enthusiasm of youth, Billy immediately dropping to his knees to greet Brutus with the exuberant affection that the dog accepted with patient grace. Emma was more reserved but no less loving, running her hand along Brutus's head in a gesture that spoke of deep affection. "How are the McKinnon horses coming along?" Robert asked as they settled around the table, the adults nursing cups of strong coffee while the children worked their way through generous portions of flapjacks and bacon. "Making progress," Eli replied. "The mayor's trust issues are resolving, and the geldings stop trying to bite everyone who approaches his stall. Give them another month, and they'll be ready to return home." It was work that fed his soul as much as his body, the patient process of healing damaged animals, of proving that gentleness could accomplish what force never could. Each success story added to his reputation, but more importantly, it added to his understanding of his own capacity for positive change. After breakfast, as the family prepared for their various daily activities, Eli found himself standing on the porch with Brutus at his side, looking out over the land that had become their home. The dog pressed against his leg, a gesture of companionship that never failed to move him. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" Eli said quietly. "From sleeping in livery stables to having a place where we belong." Brutus looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Eli could have sworn he saw understanding there, not just of the words, but of the journey they'd taken together, from brokenness to healing, from isolation to belonging. The afternoon brought visitors, as it often did. A rancher from 3 counties over had brought a horse with behavioral problems, hoping that Eli might work the same magic with his animal that he'd worked with the infamous German shepherd. There were children from town who came to play with Brutus, their laughter filling the air as they chased each other around the yard under the dog's watchful protection. As evening settled over the ranch, Eli sat on his porch whittling a piece of wood while Brutus dozed at his feet. The sign above their door caught the last rays of sunlight, its simple message a testament to the power of second chances and the courage required to offer them. Sometimes the most broken souls did find each other when the world had given up on them both. And sometimes, if they were very lucky and very patient, they found their way to something better than either had dared to hope. A place where damaged could become whole, where lost could become found, where 2 creatures with nothing left but heartache could build something beautiful from the ashes of their former lives. The gentleness of one broken man had indeed healed the fury of an abandoned dog. But more than that, it had reminded an entire community that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to believe in it and persistent enough to fight for it. In the gathering darkness, Eli continued his quiet work, while Brutus dreamed whatever dreams came to dogs who had finally found their home. Above them, the wooden sign bore witness to their transformation, proclaiming to anyone who cared to read it that all souls were welcome here, regardless of the scars they carried or the mistakes that had brought them to this place. Sometimes that was all anyone needed, a chance to start over. A patient hand extended in friendship, and the radical notion that broken things were not beyond repair. In Willow Creek, that lesson had taken root and flourished, changing not just 2 lost souls, but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to offer grace to those who needed it most.